All right, at the end of Acts 17, Paul had just spoken before the Areopagus, and there were a few that accepted the gospel. He doesn't stay in Athens for long. Chapter 18 starts, and I'm reading from the King James. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. This is recorded in history. There was uh, the emperor had told all the Jews to leave Rome, so that's clearly where Aquila and Priscilla were from originally. Uh, and Aquila and Priscilla become important at the end of Romans. Paul greets them. They host a church in their house. They had stuck out their necks for him, risked their life to try to spare him. So they're very important in Paul's life at this point. Verse 3 tells us, and because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. So every Jewish child, like their education would involve some sort of trade skill, whereby if they were to travel, they would be able to pick up work at some sort of skill. Tent maker happened to be his trade, happened to be the same as Aquila and Priscilla. So they worked together. They seem to abide together. So Paul's tent making in order to support himself financially while he is in Corinth. Of course, he had a right to take a wage or be paid as minister, evangelist, whatever. And First Corinthians deals with that, but he chose to be a tent maker. A lot of times we refer to preachers today, if they work a job and preach in their spare time, like Sundays and Wednesdays, we call them tent makers or tent making preachers because of this passage. Verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go into the Gentiles. So we see the same pattern. We see him going to the synagogue on the Sabbath, persuading some, but then some start to become envious or for whatever reason began to push back against Paul, and he shakes off the dust and moves on to the Gentiles. Verse 7, and he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. So they heard the word, they believed, and they were baptized. We have this formula here. A great number of the Corinthians were baptized, not just the handful that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 1. Verse 9, then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision, be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace. For I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. So Paul had been bold many times. He had been bold in a lot of places. But still the Lord gave him a vision, gave him assurance that he could speak boldly in the city and nothing would happen to him. Verse 11, he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So a year and a half he spends in Corinth at this time. If I remember right, this very well could be when he wrote to the Thessalonians, somewhere between chapter 17 and 18. Could very well be this year and a half span. Verse 12, and when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye into it, and I will be no judge of such matters. And he drave them out from the judgment seat. So Paul was ready to defend himself, to speak, but sometimes we don't have to when we're attacked. they brought the dispute before this man who was, he had some sort of civil authority. But when they accused him of teaching contrary to the law of Moses, Gallio didn't really care about their religious squabbles or he didn't know anything about that. He didn't know enough to make a judgment. And you wish a lot of people would, if they haven't studied the Bible in depth, they wouldn't make, certain judgments or make certain claims about what it teaches and that sort of thing. But he makes it clear, if it was something about the law, like the civil law, then obviously I'll deal with it. But he kind of trivializes the law of Moses, like words, names, and all that stuff in the law. Like, I just don't care about that. It's not my, I don't want to waste my time, essentially, which isn't a good attitude to have, but it spared Paul from the danger of any sort of arrest or punishment at this time. So the apathy and not caring of some men, sometimes it does serve a providential purpose. But that doesn't give us an excuse to be apathetic about the word of God. Verse 17. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of those things. So they decided the rule of the synagogue had, gotten a bit too high-handed and thought that he could, waste Gallio's time, essentially. So they took him and beat him, and Gallio didn't really pay attention or care. He must have thought that was all right for them to do. And then move on to verse 18. And Paul after this tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence to Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. What vow this was, and whether Paul was good or not good, or right and wrong in doing it, is a question that I don't think any Bible scholar is going to be able to figure out, so we'll just pass on. Some claim it was a Nazirite vow, others have, questions about that if it were. Verse 19, he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they desired him to tarry longer time with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep the feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. I'm going to input a little bit of my understanding. Paul is a Jewish individual, one who would reason in the synagogue, become all things to all men. A lot of the early Christians probably did go to these feasts and maybe use them as an opportunity to spread the gospel. Now, whether they partook in any temple offerings or anything like that, that's questionable. But that's all I really want to say about that. Like, Paul going back and wanting to keep the feast is his freedom as a Christian who is Jewish. Verse 22. And then he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church. He went down to Antioch. After he spent some time there, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. Now, verse 24, we have a different section, and this section may or may not be tied closely with chapter 19, but we've met Aquila and Priscilla in this journey. Now we meet Apollos. And a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. So a lot of positive things are said about Apollos. He was instructed in the way of the Lord to some extent. He was fervent in the Spirit. He was an eloquent speaker, some translations say, and he was diligent in teaching these things. But, of course, one problem, he only knew the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly, verse 26, in the synagogue, whom, when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. There's nothing wrong with hearing someone, preach or teach or say something, about the way of the Lord, and recognizing, he there's something he doesn't know, and taking him aside and expounding to him the way of God more perfectly. Now, also interestingly enough, we have a husband and wife that pull this person aside and instruct him. This would be, I think, similar to a Bible study or just a personal conversation. It doesn't give necessarily women any sort of leadership role to participate in that sort of thing, like some would argue, but we do see them working together to correct him. Verse 27, and when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much which had believed through grace. For he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. So Apollos had his own ministry, and he was very helpful to the church there, and obviously to the church at Corinth sometime later. Now, Paul's going to meet some disciples in chapter 19, and people question if they were taught John's baptism by Apollos or that sort of thing. We're going to answer that question or explore that question a little bit more deeper in Acts 19, as far as what's going on in the initial verses of that. But that'll have to be next week or later before we come back and explore the next chapter. That seems to be all that there is in Acts 18. There's a lot more we could explore, but for the time being, everyone have a good day. God bless.